Hey everyone, it's Taylorverse, and welcome to The Ruins by Scott Smith. For Elizabeth, who's known horror. I want to thank my wife, Elizabeth Hill, my editor, Victoria Wilson, and my agents, Gail Hockman and Lynn Pleasant, for their generous assistance in the completion of this book. The following people also read the manuscript in a still unfinished state and offered criticism and comments that were invariably helpful. Ben Stiller. I thank them all. Alright. They met Matthias on a day trip to Cozumel. They'd hired a guide to take them snorkeling over a local wreck, but a buoy marking its location had broken off in a storm, and the guide was having difficulty finding it. So they were just swimming about, looking at nothing in particular. Then Matthias rose toward them from the depths like a merman, a scuba tank on his back. He smiled when they told him their situation and led them to the wreck. He was German, dark from the sun, and very tall, with a blonde crew cut and pale blue eyes. He had a tattoo of an eagle on his right forearm, black with red wings. He let them take turns borrowing his tank so they could drop down 30 feet and see the wreck up close. He was friendly in a quiet way, and his English was only slightly accented, and when they pulled themselves into their guide's boat to head back to shore, he climbed in too. They met the Greeks 2 nights later, back in Cancun. On the beach near their hotel, Stacy got drunk and made out with one of them. Nothing happened beyond that, but the Greeks always seemed to be turning up afterward, no matter where they went or what they were doing. None of them spoke Greek, of course, and the Greeks didn't speak English, so it was mostly smiling and nodding, and the occasional sharing of food or drinks. There were 3 Greeks in their early 20s, like Matthias, and the rest of them, and they seemed friendly enough, even if they did appear to be following them about. The Greeks not only didn't know English, they couldn't speak Spanish either. They'd adopted Spanish names, though, which they seemed to find very amusing. Pablo and Juan and Don Quixote was how they introduced themselves. I hope I said that right. I don't know Spanish. Saying the names in their odd accent and gesturing at their chest. Don Quixote was the one Stacy made out with. All 3 looked enough alike, however, wide-shouldered and slightly padded, with their dark hair grown long and tied back in ponytails, that even Stacy had a hard time keeping track of who was who. It also seemed possible that they were trading the names around, that this was part of the joke, so the one who answered to Pablo on Tuesday would smilingly insist on Wednesday that he was Juan. They were visiting Mexico for 3 weeks. It was August, a foolish time to travel to the Yucatan. The weather was too hot, too humid. There were sudden rainstorms nearly every afternoon, downpours that could flood the street in a matter of seconds. And with the darkness, the mosquitoes arrived. Vast humming clouds of them. In the beginning, Amy complained about all of these things, wishing they'd gone to San Francisco, which had been her idea. But then Jeff lost his temper, telling her she was ruining it for everyone else, and she stopped talking about California, the bright, brisk skies, the trolley cars, the fog rolling in at dusk. It wasn't really that bad anyway. It was cheap and uncrowded, and she decided to make the best of it. There were 4 of them in all, Amy and Stacy and Jeff and Eric. Amy and Stacy were best friends. They'd cut their hair boyishly short for the trip, and they wore matching Panama hats, posing for photos arm in arm. They looked like sisters, Amy the fair one, Stacy the dark, both of them tiny, barely 5 feet tall, bird-like in their thinness. They were sisterly in their behavior, too, full of whispered secrets, wordless intimacies, knowing looks. Jeff was Amy's boyfriend. Eric was Stacy's. The boys were friendly with each other, but not exactly friends. It had been Jeff's idea to travel to Mexico, a last fling before he and Amy started medical school in the fall. He'd found a good deal on the internet, cheap and possible to pass up. It would be 3 lazy weeks on the beach, lying in the sun, doing nothing. He'd convinced Amy to come with him, and then Amy had convinced Stacy, and Stacy had convinced Eric. Matthias told them that he'd come to Mexico with his younger brother, Henrik. But Henrik had gone missing. It was a confusing story, and none of them understood all of the details. Whenever they asked him about it, Matthias became vague and upset. He slipped into German and waved his hands, and his eyes grew cloudy with the threat of tears. After a while, they didn't ask any more. It felt impolite to press. Eric believed that drugs were somehow involved, that Matthias's brother was on the run from the authorities, but whether these authorities were German, American, or Mexican, he couldn't say for certain. There'd been a fight, though. They all agreed upon this. Matthias had argued with his brother, perhaps even struck him, and then Henrik had disappeared. Matthias was worried, of course. He was waiting for him to return so that they could fly back to Germany. Sometimes he seemed confident that Henrik would eventually reappear and that all would be fine in the end, but other times he didn't. Matthias was reserved by nature, a listener rather than a talker, and prone in his present situation to sudden bouts of gloom. The 4 of them worked hard to cheer him up. Eric told funny stories, Stacy did her imitations, Jeff pointed out interesting sights, and Amy took countless photographs, ordering everyone to smile. In the day, they sunned on the beach, sweating beside one another on their brightly colored towels. They swam and snorkeled, they got burned and began to peel. They rode horses, paddled around in kayaks, played miniature golf. One afternoon, Eric convinced them all to rent a sailboat, but it turned out he wasn't as adept at sailing as he claimed, and they had to be towed back to the dock. It was embarrassing and expensive. At night they ate seafood and drank too much beer. Eric didn't know about Stacy and the Greek. He'd gone to sleep after dinner, leaving the 3 to wander around the beach with Matthias. There'd been a bonfire burning behind one of the neighboring hotels, a band playing in a gazebo. That was where they met the Greeks. The Greeks were drinking tequila and clapping in rhythm with the music. They offered to share the bottle. Stacy sat next to Don Quixote, and there was much talking in their mutually exclusive languages, and much laughter, and the bottle passed back and forth, everyone wincing at the burning taste of the liquor, and then Amy turned and found Stacy embracing the Greek. It didn't last very long, 5 minutes of kissing, a shy touch of her left breast, and the band was finished for the night. Don Quixote wanted her to go back to his room, but she smiled and shook her head, and it was over as easily as that. In the morning, the Greeks laid out their towels alongside Matthias and the 4 of them on the beach, and in the afternoon they all went jet skiing together. You wouldn't have known about the kissing if you hadn't seen it. The Greeks were very gentlemanly, very respectful. Eric seemed to like them too. He was trying to get them to teach him dirty words in Greek. He was frustrated, though, because it was hard to tell if the words they were teaching him were the ones he wanted to learn. It turned out that Henrik had left a note. Matthias showed it to Amy and Jeff early one morning during the 2nd week of their vacation. It was handwritten in German with a shakily drawn map at the bottom. They couldn't read the note, of course. Matthias had to translate it for them. There wasn't anything about drugs or the police. That was just Eric being Eric, jumping to conclusions, the more dramatic the better. Henrik had met a girl on the beach. She'd flown in that morning, was on her way to the interior, where she'd been hired to work on an archaeological dig. It was at an old mining camp. Maybe a silver mine, maybe emeralds. Matthias wasn't certain. Henrik and his girl had spent the day together. He'd bought her lunch and they'd gone swimming. Then he took her back to his room where they showered and had sex. Afterward, she left on a bus. In the restaurant over lunch, she'd drawn a map for him. Shush. on a napkin, showing him where the dig was. She told him he should come too, and that they'd be glad for his help. Once she left, Henrik couldn't stop talking about her. He didn't eat dinner, and he couldn't fall asleep. In the middle of the night, he sat up in bed and was announced to Matthias that he was going to join the dig. Matthias called him a fool. He'd only just met the girl, and they were in the midst of their vacation, and he didn't know the first thing about archaeology. Henrik assured him that it was really none of his business. He wasn't asking for Matthias's permission, he was merely informing him of his decision. He climbed out of bed and started to pack. They called each other names, and Henrik threw an electric razor at Matthias, hitting him on the shoulder. Matthias rushed him, knocking him over. They rolled on the hotel floor, grappling, grunting obscenities, until Matthias accidentally headbutted Henrik in the mouth, cutting his lip. Henrik made much of this, rushing to the bathroom so that he could spit blood into the sink. Matthias pulled on some clothes and went out to get him some ice, but then ended up going downstairs to the all-night bar by the pool. It was 3 a.m. Matthias felt he needed to calm down. He drank 2 beers, one quickly, the other slowly. Then he got back to their room. The note was sitting on his pillow, and Henrik was gone. So, I just realized that, you have to get to page, almost 1,000 before the next chapter, so I'm gonna just end this one here at around 10 minutes. And, yeah. We'll bookmark that right there. Give a little suspense. And I'll see you all next time. Bye, guys.